You know what? Lolly, Lolly, would you get my phone out of my purse and hand it to me? That's how I tell what time it is, and I left it there. That's how I know if I need to hush. Okay. Ministry. No, I knew someone was going to ask me that, so I went upstairs and asked. Uh, the newsletter isn't out yet. They're working on it. They meant for, I think they intended to try to get it out last week, but it isn't out yet. Yeah. I went up and I said, I didn't get a women's ministry newsletter. And she said, well, they're still working on it. And I said, okay, because someone's going to ask me about it, and I need to be able to answer them. So, okay, ladies, let's get started. And actually, that housekeeping point, I'm glad you brought that up, was that I told you last week that the recordings from this Bible study would be links to them in the women's ministry newsletter, and there will be, but the newsletter hasn't come out yet. So I don't have the links. And if it doesn't come out in the next day or two, I'll be up here tomorrow. I'll ask them if they'll just give them to me so we can give them to you, whether you have the newsletter or not. So let's start with that. I want to start this morning. I think it's pretty amazing that in Hosea, he is prophesying about Israel being taken over by Assyria and scattered because of their sin. And we have, since Saturday, have a war in Israel. I'm not here to tell you it's because of their sin, but we have had a war break out, and it has been heavy on my heart. I just told Mike Phillips was in here, and I said, you know, I don't get depressed. That's not part of my nature. And only twice, I can count on two fingers, times where I felt like I was at all. It's not me. But when this all started, it has just weighed heavy on me what's going on in Israel. And Mike said he made the mistake of listening to Fox on the radio on the way in. Well, I did too. But I listen purposely to see if there's anything that applies to what we're studying today. And in that process, in the different news reports, and I'm sure all of you have heard from whatever you listen to, some news reports about what's going on there. But on Fox, they were interviewing United States citizens, families here who have family there that either have dual citizenship and have moved or for whatever reason, who are missing and they haven't heard from. And they don't know where they are. And my heart goes out to them. So I'm going to start with this little story of that, and then also applying to what happens to Israel today because of their sin. When my son Stephen was 5, almost 6 years old, and Christy had just turned 8, that means Joshua was 10, we took a trip like we usually did every summer to Pueblo, Colorado, to see my parents. And we were at my parents' house, and Joshua and Stephen went on that day in Pueblo. You could let your kids go a block and a half away to play at the playground. Okay, so Josh and Stephen went down to play at a school playground, block and a half from my parents' house. And I was at the house with Christy and Josh and my mom and dad, and they were told, you know, Joshua, you have to be back in 30 minutes. And he was a kid that always did that. He's a pretty responsible child. So they went, and pretty soon Josh came back in the door. And it took me a minute, but I thought, well, where's Stephen? You know, he didn't come in the door with Joshua. So he went straight to the bathroom, so I knocked on the bathroom door and said, Joshua, where's Stephen? He said, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know where Stephen is? He went with you to play at the playground. And he said, well, in Pueblo, they actually have alleys that go down the middle of the block. So the boys had gone out the back of my parents' house and down the alley and down to play. So he said, on the way back, we came to that first alley, and Joshua insisted that was the way to Grandma and Grandpa's, and I told him it wasn't, but he said it wasn't, and so I just let him go. So here we are with a 5, almost 6-year-old who is gone, and we can't find him. And we went to look for him. He wasn't at the playground. He wasn't in anybody's alley, and he was nowhere to be found. So it was a Sunday afternoon, and we called the police, and Fortunately, the policeman that came to us in Pueblo said, well, there's not much going on this afternoon, so we have 3 patrol cars out looking for him. My dad went out looking for him. I have a lot of family in Pueblo. They all gathered and went out in groups looking for him. But the police wouldn't let me go look for him. They made me stay at my parents' house. They said that if they should hear anything, they wanted to know exactly where I was. Or if Stephen came home, they wanted me there. So he was gone for about 3.5 hours where we did not know where he was. And I couldn't stay in the house. I was pacing my parents' driveway. I couldn't make myself sit in the house and wait to see what would happen. And this was pre-cell phone days, so we couldn't call back and forth to each other on a cell phone and report what we knew. And my dad found him about 3.5 hours later, and he was 1.5 miles away. Stephen was a very gregarious little kid. He'd talk to anybody. He was happy all the time. And he had had a great time. Because he had talked to this man doing his yard work, and this lady who had 2 of her kids out in their wagon passing out Bible school announcements. But when my dad found him, he was getting ready to pass one of the major roads, almost like a highway in Pueblo. And he found him, and he brought him home. And when he got to the driveway with Stephen, Stephen jumped out of the car and walked up to me, and we used to call him E.T. because his eyes would get so big, big-eyed, and I picked him up, and he clung to me for a long time. So at the same time he was having a good time, he also knew he couldn't find his way home. It had never occurred to me to teach Stephen my parents' address in Pueblo at 5. He knew his address at home. He knew his home phone number. He knew he lived in Houston, Texas, but he didn't know where my parents lived in Pueblo. They were just his grandma and grandpa that lived in Pueblo. And I learned a lesson that day about teaching little kids how to find home even when you're not home, to have some more information. But I also think that that applies to what is happening with the people of Israel today. And my heart goes out to those families who don't know. Because I remember the terror of that day. I remember being scared to death. I remember not being able to even sit still. I've been a believer since I was 7. You can say, well, we'll just pray. Well, when your kid's missing, it takes a whole lot more than the simple, let's just pray about it. And so I think about those people today who I heard talking on the radio today, who I saw talking on the TV last night. And I think about the other things that are going on. And it breaks my heart for Israel. It breaks my heart for mankind that we are in such a state that these kind of things can happen. And who can rescue? Who can rescue? Can the United States rescue Israel? No, not really. I mean, they can help. They can't rescue them. Can the United States rescue the Ukraine? No. We can help. But there is someone who knows the plan, and there is someone who can save, and there is someone that's going to bring this to an end. I do believe we're in end times. I think that, that's been said, we were joking, that's been said throughout history, but one day it's truly going to be the end times, and it could very well be now with what we're looking at and what we're facing. So that puts a lot more weight on the study of Hosea than we would have otherwise. Because what the prophets are saying through Hosea and Isaiah and Jeremiah is, Israel, wake up. You've gone away from your God. You've gone away from the one that provides for you. You've gone away from the one that loves you. You have left. If you don't wake up, this is what's going to happen. When the Lord comes again, someone asked yesterday, how come it's taking him so long? Because he's a merciful God. And there are still people who need to come to him. But one day he's going to say, just like he's saying to Israel about their time of no longer being a nation, it's enough. It's full. And he's going to return. Now, I'll finish our lesson with why I think that's important to us today, but that just hit me, and I don't want to fail to acknowledge what is going on in Israel today. And let's not leave out the Ukraine, and I could name several other places. Who? Azerbaijan. Um, this world is in bad shape. But there is a God of this world, and believe it or not, he is still in control. He was in control then, and he's in control now. He knows what he's doing, and we can trust him. Pray with me before we start. Father, thank you that you gave us your word, and that you didn't hide the hard things and only give us the easy things, but you show us who you are through the history of this nation, and you show us who you are today. Help us to see your face, help us to know you well, and help us to follow you. Let our answers to you be yes. For it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, we're in the 9th and 10th chapters of Hosea, and I have to tell you that I searched and searched for the redemption in these 2 chapters. I found one verse, and I almost went into 11, because the good news is next week it starts out with some of God's real love for his people. But for these 2 weeks, we need to talk about something. So the main thing in chapter 9, if I had a word to describe that whole chapter, I would say it's hostility. What the Lord is going to judge Israel for in this chapter is hostility. Okay, and so we're going to start, rather than verse 1, we're going to start with verse 7, because it really is the crux of, let me make my font smaller in my book so I can read it easier. It is the crux of the issue that's going on. So verses 7 and 8 say, "The days of punishment have come, the days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The man of the spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred." There's something about the word hostility that carries heavier weight than just mad. There's something about hostility that has an element of retaliation for something in it. And so what God is saying is that the days of punishment for Israel have come. Now we know from the study that it's going to be about 30 years before Israel's totally destroyed. But God is saying the days have come, and the chance to turn around is very short at this time. The days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. Israel shall know it. They're going to know that this is a returning of consequence for the way Israel's lived. They're going to, through the times of captivity, they're actually going to come to repentance over it, but they're going to know it even then. What's one of the first questions someone asks when something bad happens? Why did this happen? So you know they're going to be asking that question, and in their hearts they're going to know that this is a judgment from God. The prophet shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The man of the spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. He is judging them for the way they have treated his prophets. They have called them mad. They've called Hosea mad, and it would be kind of hard not to when he's gone and married a prostitute and then gone back and got her, when you don't think of that as God's spokesman speaking. But they have called him and Jeremiah known as the weeping prophet, and Isaiah and the other prophets. The people didn't want to listen. So if you don't want to listen and someone is out there telling you the bad things you don't want to hear, basically what do you say? He's crazy. He's just crazy. He's just out there talking and he's crazy. But in Israel's case, the prophets were not crazy. They were refusing to listen. The picture I had was the monkey see no evil, hear no evil. Hear no evil with their hands over their, or Christy used to put her hands over her ears when she knew and hear what Joshua was saying and then start saying la 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 so she wouldn't have to listen. That's kind of the picture you get of what Israel's doing. And God says, because of your great iniquity and great hatred, you are calling your prophets, the ones I sent to warn you out of care, you're just saying these guys are crazy and we don't need to listen to them. And then in verse 8, the prophet is the watchman of Ephraim, or that would be Israel here, watchman of Israel with my God. Yet a fowler's snare is on all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. He's saying, the prophets are my watchmen. What's a watchman supposed to do? He's supposed to watch and warn the city when there's danger coming. And the prophets are out there saying there's danger coming. There's a reason for it. They don't leave it alone. They actually tell them why, and I think it's the why they don't want to hear the most. But they're saying there's danger coming, and this is the reason for it, and this is the way to not have to go through the danger. And instead, the people are calling them crazy, and they're refusing to listen. There's hatred in the house of his God. They actually hate the prophets. So we start out down there instead of the first verse just to see who the prophets were, who Hosea was, and what God's intention was, but then the reception that he's going to receive. Hosea wasn't only told by God to go find this prostitute and marry her and have children with her and then go back and buy her back and bring her back. He also was told to stand up and tell the people what they didn't want to hear. What they didn't want to hear. There's another scripture that says that in end times men's ears will be tickled. They won't listen. They only want to listen to the whatever is wonderful and good and makes them feel good. Well, the people of Israel didn't want to hear either. And so God says to Hosea, not only is your life going to be an example of where Israel is and what happens with it, but they're not going to want to hear what you want to say, but you got to go say it anyway. Would you like his job description? I think I'd find another work. But Hosea was obedient, and he did what was called. No wonder Jonah ran away. So in verse 1 of verse 9, it says, Rejoice not, O Israel, exult not the peoples, for you have played the whore, forsaking your God. You have loved a prostitute's wages on all threshing floors. He starts out by telling them, don't rejoice. Well, one of the things that just happened in Israel, I don't know if you heard tied in the news at all, but they just finished the festival of Sukkot, or however you want to pronounce it, which is the festival of booths. And it ran from the 29th of January to the 6th of October, which was Friday. And then on Saturday morning, they evidently at Shabbat, in their synagogues, they have a service that kind of ties it all up in a knot, is that I want to say. So I read an article from a rabbi of one of those talking about how they had just gotten into their certain order of service, and I don't even understand all their order of service, but into it, and they heard the sirens go off because Israel was being attacked. And then he tells the story about his son-in-law, who's in that service, says to him, he gets a phone call, and he's being called up to the military. And so then he gets home, and I don't even know if he's home yet, his son calls, who's in the reserve, and he's being called up. And he has to drive his son to the airport where he can catch his ride to go and report for duty. And he says normally it's against the law to drive their vehicles on the Sabbath, but he drove him because Sabbath laws are suspended in an emergency. So he took his son to the airport, and then while he was there, his daughter-in-law, or his daughter, who's in the reserve, said she was probably going to be called up, and then another son's called up. So within the span of the day Saturday, his son-in-law, 2 sons, and his daughter were all called up to reserves. And he doesn't know where they went or where they're at now. What Hosea is saying is this time is coming. You're going to be judged by God, and it's going to happen suddenly. We'll see that in one of these verses. It's going to happen suddenly, and when it does, it's going to be too late. Okay? So it goes on and it says, you've loved a prostitute's wages on all threshing floors. The threshing floor, what is that? Where they would thresh out the grain when they brought it in, and also the olives from the olive trees. So it was a threshing floor for grain, and it was a threshing floor for, I guess you crush, I didn't go look that all up, but crush the olives, get the oil, whatever you do with olives in Israel. That's what the threshing floor was for, and they would usually use an animal, usually a cow, that would walk kind of, I've seen a picture where they walk in a circle where they're crushing out the grain, because they didn't have all our automated stuff to do what they do. So he says, you have loved a prostitute's wages on all the threshing floors. So here we are, we're giving praise to Baal because of the fertility god for sending rain and giving us all of this produce and these crops that we've been able to have, which at that point in Israel, they'd been pretty prosperous with all their stuff. which even made it worse when they'd go to all these shrines and they would worship God and Baal at the same time, but give credit to Baal for what had been given, the gifts that had been given. So his threshing floor and wine and vat shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail them. They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean food in Assyria. So what he's saying is the judgment is you're not going to have those crops at the threshing floor in the first place, but you're not even going to be here if you did, because you're going to get removed. There's not going to be any wine or new wine. There's not going to be the produce in order to thresh it out in the first place, because they're not going to remain in the land of the Lord. Okay, something hit me about that. When God told Israel, he brought them into the wilderness, they crossed the Red Sea, they spent their 40 years there, they went into the promised land. There's always been a sense that the land is as important as the people. And I spent a lot of years thinking, well, how does God put so much importance on the land? Well, he puts importance on the land because he brought the people there, if I get it right, he brought the people there into the land that's called the what? Holy Land? Because it was the land that God had prepared for his people to live and live well. A land flowing with milk and honey. A land that produced everything they needed to live. And that they would worship him as the one who had blessed them with all of that through the land that he had control over. So when he says they're not going to remain in the land is still the Holy Land. The land is still the Holy Land today. The land is still the land that God intended for that purpose. But what he's saying is, Israel, you're not going to get to stay. You have to leave. And we know throughout history they had to leave. We know that what year was it Israel was reestablished? In the 1940s? Okay, and until then there hadn't been an Israel for a very, very, very long time. Because he's telling them they're not going to get to stay in the land. They're going to be taken away. But Ephraim shall return to Egypt. Now, he is not saying Egypt, Egypt, because they didn't actually go to Egypt. They went to Assyria. But the idea is that Egypt is where they were and where they had their beginnings and where they were enslaved. And God set them free. And now they're going to return to enslavement. They're going to return to being under someone else's rule. And they're going to be treated not as the best citizens in the world when they get there. They're going to return to the same experience that they'd had in Egypt. And they shall eat unclean food in Assyria. Well, Assyria is not worshiping God. So what's one of the big arguments in the New Testament? Can you remember over whether you could eat the meat that had been used to sacrifice to the false gods? That argument went on from then to then. And he's telling them, when you get to Assyria, the food you're eating is not going to be the holy food that God has given you. It's going to be the food that the Assyrians eat. It's going to be unclean according to Jewish law. It's not going to be the proper thing. There are lots of things they weren't supposed to eat. Remember, they weren't supposed to eat pork, certain cloven-hoofed animals, all those things that were in the law. He's saying you're not going to be able to follow them. All that you've known, all that I've commanded of you, all that has made you Israel, you are not going to be able to do once you're taken captive. They shall not pour drink offerings of wine to the Lord, and their sacrifices shall not please him. It shall be like mourner's bread to them, and all who eat it shall be defiled, for their bread shall be for their hunger only. It shall not come to the house of the Lord. There's a little bit of a messianic thing in here, because what did Jesus say he was? The bread of life, okay? So he says, not only are you not going to have the drink offerings that go along with your sacrifices, you're not going to, the bread that you eat is not going to be bread that is blessed and has a picture, actually, of the coming Messiah who's the bread of life. It's just going to be bread that'll fill your stomach. All who eat of the bread, because the bread is defiled. Why is it defiled? Because they're in a defiled place now. They're going to eat defiled bread in a defiled land. It should not come to the house of the Lord. They're not going to take that into God's house and have it sanctified and cleansed. So I'd like sometime to do a study that only talks about bread from Old Testament to New. It would be really interesting to see all that there is there. Okay, verse 5. What will you do on the day of the appointed festival and on the day of the feast of the Lord? He's saying, what will you do on those days when you can't do this? He starts out the chapter by saying, don't rejoice. The festivals were the rejoicing. And now he's saying, what are you going to do? You cannot do your festivals in captivity. So what are you going to do on those days? Or maybe just remember, but not be able to do? In verse 6, for behold, they are going away from destruction, but Egypt shall gather them. Memphis shall bury them. Nettles shall possess their precious things of silver. Thorns shall be in their tents. They're going away from the destruction in Israel, but Egypt, put in there Assyria, is going to gather them in. And this Memphis was a place that, right now I think they say it's about 90 miles north of current-day Cairo, and it's known for being a burial place. Okay? So what he's saying is you're going to go to the foreign land and you're going to die in the foreign land. Okay? Most of those that were taken captive never got to return. I saw a percentage, but I don't know how accurate it is, of like 95% of those taken captive were never lived long enough to return back to Israel. So he's saying you're going to go, you're going to be taken captive, you're not going to be able to do your feasts and your festivals, you're not going to be able to worship the way God's told you to, you're going to have to just make do with what you've got, and then you're basically never coming home again. Okay? Just wow, what a downer. It's just tough. Okay, and nettles shall possess their precious things of silver, and thorns shall be in their tents. What they're saying is that their homes they've left are just going to grow up in ruin. You know what takes over? I love in Alaska, the first thing that takes over after a fire is called fireweed, and it reminds you of the Texas bluebonnet, except it's very fiery red, and it covers the area after a fire. But this isn't even that. It's nettles and thistles. It's just there in the ruins. 7, the days of punishment have come, the days of recompense have come, as we read well ago. Israel shall know it, the prophet is a fool, the man of the spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. The prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God. Yet a fowler's snare is on all his ways, and hatred in the house of God. Who are our watchmen today? Who? We're all the watchmen today. Yeah. We have ministers, and we need to listen to the ones that are, as Pastor Greg does, directly dividing the word of truth. But the real watchman for us is us knowing the scripture and what God has to say well enough to be able to warn the people. Had a big disappointment this week. My Jewish sister-in-law and her husband, my brother-in-law, my husband's brother, and their 2 children, who are now grown, have come to my house for Christmas since their children were 2 and 3 years old. Their children are now in their late 20s. Their daughter just got married in June, and their son just got engaged last weekend. So they're grown, working, out of college. And for the first time in all these years, they're not coming to my house for Christmas. And I don't like it. But the main reason I don't like it, besides just missing them and enjoying them, is because I have seen through the years they first started to come the opportunity to talk to them about the Lord every time they're in my house. I keep nativities all around my house. I like them, but it's not that I love nativities. I want them to see them when they come in my house. And it's a big disappointment to me that they're not coming and that I'm not going to get this year to do what I've been doing for so many years. So I'll just pray for another opportunity where they'll all show up. But in the meantime, it's our job to be the watchman. So when God says that the prophets were his watchmen then now we have the written word that we can go to and we can read. But we are the watchmen. And who has God put in our lives that we're to be the watchman for? Because there's somebody or many somebodies in all of our lives that's the purpose. Okay, verse 9. They have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. The days of Gibeah, I'm not going to describe that story completely to you. You can find it in Judges chapters 19, 20, and 21. It is not a pretty story. Basically, there was a situation with a man and his concubine where the city of Gibeah, because they could not get the guy hosting them to send the man out for them to have relations with. What does that sound like, Sodom and Gomorrah? They send out his concubine, and they spend the whole night raping her. She dies in the morning. The man takes her home. This is going to sound really gross, but we're thinking about what's happening in Israel right now. It's probably not any more gross. He cuts her body into 12 pieces, and he sends a piece to every tribe in Israel. Okay, now this is the tribe of Benjamin. And what happens is 10 of the 12 tribes then go against Benjamin. And it describes this whole story in those 3 chapters. And it's a very interesting story. We could do a whole Bible study on it. But what he's saying here is they have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. So what I described to you was going on in Gibeah is how corrupt Israel had become at the time Hosea is prophesying. Or maybe as our world has come with what's going on in Israel now. So he says God will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. And he says, like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel like the first fruit of the fig tree on its first season. The fig tree evidently produces twice in a season, and the first fruit is evidently really sweet and to be desirable. There's actually some scriptures that talk about the first fruits of the fig tree and how people love them because they're so good. And he's saying that's the way God found Israel, like the first fruit on the fig tree, and like grapes in the wilderness. You don't generally see a lot of grapevines growing out in the desert. So he's saying he found this. I saw your fathers, but they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame and became detestable like the thing they loved. He said, I found them like refreshing new grapes in an unexpected place. I found them like the first fruits of a fig tree, beautiful and wanting to have and be around. But instead, Israel, when they came to this place, decided to worship the false gods. And I think some of your scriptures may mention the 2 places. I think one was Midian. And he says they love that more than worshiping God. 11, Ephraim's glory shall fly away like a bird, no birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, I will bereave them till none is left. Woe to them when I depart from them. He says, Israel's glory is going to fly, the glory of having the offspring that could also worship God. And he says, I'm going to make it so they don't have offspring. He said there's going to be barrenness, and there's going to be miscarriages, and there's going to be the type of things that today we have a whole ministry that goes out to those that are not able to have children or have lost children in miscarriage. My own daughter has lost 2 children in miscarriage. He says that's the way it's going to be for you now, because I'm not going to let you have more children to do more sinning. I'm not going to let you multiply your sin through your children anymore. Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in a meadow, but Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. Give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts, in other words, no baby to nurse. Every evil of theirs is in Gilgal. There I began to hate them because of the wickedness of their deeds. I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are rebels. Wow. But what he's saying to them is, look at the hostility that has to be in the people of Israel for them to have fallen so far and so low away from a holy God who had led them across the Red Sea, who had sustained them through the years in the wilderness, who had brought them into the promised land and given them then such victory over conquering the land they were going to live in, and has given them all this prosperity. And this is what they've done with it. Does it sound like somebody we know now? Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up, they shall bear no fruit. Even though they give birth, I will put their beloved children to death. My God will reject them because they have not listened to him. They shall be wanderers among the nations. I have to tell you, when I was studying this, I got to joke, some of you have heard this. On Tuesday, after I got home from studying, I thought, well, I'm just going to go over the next 2 chapters today, and I've got a week that it can kind of soak in. And so I went through these 2 chapters. I was begging them to be short chapters by the end of them. I was thinking, is this the last verse? Can I get to the next chapter? Because this is tough stuff. So I got to the end of the 10th chapter, and I thought, I think I'm going to go over into 2 Timothy 3 because that's what we were teaching Sunday morning. Because then I'm going to be in the New Testament and maybe I'll find some little softer stuff to look at for a little while. So I opened up 2 Timothy 3. You know what the first 3 verses are? In the latter days there will be in at least 16 sins that are going on in the latter days. I looked at that and I shut my computer, I shoved it all back, and I said, Lord, no more Bible study today. I will look tomorrow, but I'm done for today. It's just a mess. And if you let it, it can really get you. And you can become depressed, and you can become down, and you can begin to wonder, what in the world, what am I supposed to do? The good news is, as I said earlier, God is still in control. He has a purpose, he has a plan, and we get to be part of it, and the victory is coming. But they had to wade through a lot of stuff because of their sin. And we live in a world that's going to have to wade through a lot of stuff because of its sin. Okay, Hosea 10. And my main word for this chapter was idolatry. So that'll give you a little clue where we're going next. But in the idolatry of Israel, verse 1 says, Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. What they're saying is the more successful, the more prosperous they became, instead of using that prosperity for God's plan, they used it to build more false altars and to give more credit to a false god. Okay, so the more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. Hymns always come to mind, I guess because I sang them on my father's lap when I was 3, but they always come to mind. So in this particular, it was break down every altar, something every fear. Now wash me and I shall be whiter than snow. He is going to break down their altars so that they can't be used for false worship. And we're going to talk at the end here a little bit about some altars or maybe idols in our own life that he needs to break down. For now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? Remember, Israel insisted they wanted a king. Do you remember that? And God finally said, okay, if you want a king, I will give you what you're asking for, and you can have a king. And he gave them Saul, and that kind of turned into a disaster. So then he gave them David, who was a good king, and a king after God's own heart. And then he gave them Solomon, and then it kind of went downhill from there for the rest of Israel's history and most of Judah's history. So they wanted a king. So now he says they're going to come to a point in exile where they're going to say, what can a king do for us? We wanted a king, but he hasn't saved us. He couldn't keep us safe. For they utter mere words with empty oaths. They make covenants, so judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. They've made these covenant promises to God, and they haven't kept them. So he says, they don't mean anything. You've made promises you didn't keep. Have you ever been disappointed by somebody? Has anybody ever not kept a promise? Let me ask you a question, too. Do you hold grudges? Do you hold grudges? You know, I was really proud of myself because I didn't hold grudges. I really was. I thought, I don't hold grudges. I'm just not one of those people who holds grudges. So there's a man in this church many years ago, and I used to go and sit in the surgery waiting rooms and with family when somebody was having surgery. And I was with a friend of mine whose baby was having heart surgery, born with a heart defect. And it was a many-hour surgery. And a group of people came from here. And I was sitting beside her, and every once in a while the nurse would come out and tell her where they were with the surgery. And the nurse came out and, a couple, 3 times, and the report was pretty good. They've started surgery, everything seems to be going well, all the things they say. And then the nurse came out, and she said, it's not going as well right now. And, of course, that's devastating. And here's my friend with her baby girl that's in surgery and hearing that at this point things are a little shaky. But there was a man there, and I'm not going to tell you who he was, and he's not here anymore, but from this church, and he's a great guy. But he's standing in the doorway across the waiting room, and as soon as the nurse left, he said, lady, you just heard a good report. Now, I do this all the time. This is part of what I do, is sit in waiting rooms. You don't tell somebody something's good when it's not good. Instead, you weep with them. There's laugh with those that laugh and weep with those that weep. And I looked at him, and I didn't say a word because it wasn't my job, but I'm thinking, go away. Find somewhere else to be. So then the nurse said it would be two or 3 hours before she brought another report, and so it was lunchtime. So then he decided that this friend of mine should go to lunch while she was waiting. And he began to try to talk her into going to lunch, and I finally said, she's not going to lunch. We're staying here because we don't know when they're going to come again. If you want to bring her something to eat, go ahead. You go to lunch. I really did that because I tend to speak when I shouldn't sometimes. So he took a group of people, and he went to lunch. And then the baby survived and, by the way, grew up and got married and had kids. So the end of the story is great for the baby. But I didn't like that man from then on. And I didn't think about him for a long time. And then he spoke somewhere, and on the way home from church here, my husband hears all my opinions that nobody else ever hears. So on the way home from here, I was just spouting off about this guy who I hadn't seen in years, had only had that one encounter with that many years ago. And I'm just spouting off. And Frank's always good for me because he's a man of few words, and he looks over at me and goes, holding a grudge, huh? And out of my mouth before I could stop it, I said, I don't hold grudges. Yes, I did, and the Lord took me to task for that. We need not to hold grudges. We need to look at them and say, is this either an altar in my life I've come to, a right I have to break my worship with the Lord? I've discovered since then, in the years since then, that, yeah, I do hold grudges, but I try really hard to ask the Lord to identify them quickly so I can get them back out of my life. Well, these people were holding grudges against God and praising Baal because they didn't want to hear what God had to say to them. It was easier to accept Baal than it was their own responsibility for their sin, and now the judgment is coming because of their idolatry. The inhabitants of Samaria tremble, for the calf of Beth-aven, its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests, those who rejoiced over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. You know what the calf at Beth-aven was? What was Bethel? Do you remember the story in the scripture about Bethel? Bethel was the story of Jacob when he was headed out, running away from all that he'd done, and he ends up sleeping with his head on a rock, and he sees Jacob's ladder. And he names that place Bethel, called House of God. Okay, so that's how Bethel started, and it had a history in Israel of being the house of God. When Jacob came back, he actually built an altar at Bethel to worship God for returning home many, many years later. But when Jeroboam was king in Israel, he was afraid that the people of Israel would go to Jerusalem to worship, which is what God told them to do. So he didn't want them to do that because he's afraid, and he says literally, if they go to Jerusalem to worship, they may not see me as king anymore. So he builds an altar at Bethel, now called Beth-aven, and he puts a golden calf there. Remember Israel's history of the golden calf all the way back at the mountain when Moses brings the Ten Commandments? He puts a golden calf here, and he tells Israel, this is where you go to worship. So when he's talking about Samaria and the calf at Beth-aven, he's talking about the golden calf that was put there by Jeroboam, and the people were told to worship there instead of going to Jerusalem. And what God is saying is going to happen there is the inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Beth-aven. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests. They don't want to lose the calf at Beth-aven. But God says, those who rejoiced over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. And there are actually artifacts from Assyria that testify to the fact that this calf was taken to Assyria. I love when archaeology proves the Bible. It's just great. So, Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The high places of Avon, the sins of Israel, or that's Beth-aven, shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills fall on us. He said they're going to be in so much trouble, they're going to hope the mountains fall on them instead. I'm not sure what they're doing back there. So then, verse 9 in chapter 10 and verse 9 in chapter 9 both talk about Gibeah. It says, from the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. There they have continued. Shall not the war against the unjust overtake them in Gibeah? So Gibeah is something they understood. If you read it and you didn't hear what I'd said earlier and didn't know the history, you would go, well, what's Gibeah? But what God's really saying is that sin was so corrupted that it's doubled. It's doubled because of the sin of Gibeah. And he says it's been that way. You've grown into this double portion of sin since the time of Gibeah. When I please, I will discipline them, and nations shall be gathered against them when they are bound up for their double iniquity. And he calls it double iniquity or double sin. And he says, when I please. In other words, God is in control. This judgment is coming, but it'll happen when God decides it's going to happen and not anybody else. Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck, but I will put Ephraim to the yoke. Judah must plow. Jacob must harrow for himself. What he's talking about with this cow in the beginning is when the cow is threshing, it's not muzzled, and so it's able to eat as it works. It gets to eat some of the grain. And what he's saying is Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh. He loved to thresh because he got to eat. And I spared her fair neck, but I will put Ephraim to the yoke. He's now going to be yoked with someone else besides God. And his work will be to tread out the recompense of his sins. And Judah must plow. Jacob must harrow for himself. He says they're all going to have to take care of themselves because I'm not going to take care of them anymore. That's pretty scary. Sow for yourselves righteousness. This is the best verse in these two chapters. Sow for yourself righteousness, reap steadfast love, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. He's saying there's still time. Sow for yourself righteousness. Turn back and live in righteousness. In the Amplified Bible, anytime it had the word righteousness, it'll have brackets that say right standing with God. So the definition of righteousness is right standing with God. Sow to yourself righteousness. How do you sow righteousness? Plant the seeds of righteousness. Walk in righteousness. Do the things that are in right standing with God. Break up your fallow ground. You know, when they get ready to plant, I was watching someone, I like this farm thing I watch. I was watching someone who was planting seed, and so they've got the big machinery now that'll, break up the furrows. You don't have to go out with your plow and your horse or your cow or whatever you use, but they break it up, and then the seed is planted immediately as they go. It says, break up your fallow ground. Break it up and get ready for those seeds of righteousness you're going to plant. For it's time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. You have plowed iniquity. You have reaped injustice. You have eaten the fruit of lies, because you have trusted in your own way and the multitude of your warriors. Therefore the tumult of war shall rise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be destroyed, as Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle. Mothers were dashed in pieces with their children. Lovely. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, because of your great evil. At dawn the king of Israel shall be utterly cut off. That's the picture of it's going to happen quickly. At dawn he's going to be cut off. Okay, that's the end of those two chapters with the hostility that Israel had toward God and showed in every action they did, and with God's judgment of their idolatry and what was going to come because of it. So it's a hard lesson, but it's a good lesson, but why do we need to know about it today? Well, I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, last Tuesday evening study, when I just put it all away till the next day, sometimes it can get overwhelming. And sometimes life can get overwhelming today. And there are times when we need to just stop and say, Lord, I'm going to leave it in your hands, and I'll be back in the morning, and then pick it up again with me, like I was. But there are things to learn from all of this. Hosea was prophesying to Israel in a time when their sin had grown to enormous proportions. And like I said about 1 Timothy 3, it gives a list of 16 enormous proportion things that are wrong and sinful in this world in the end times, which I believe are today. So What does that mean? Has man gotten any better? You know, I was always taught, you ever have a history teacher when you go in at the beginning of the year and they tell you, why do we study history? We study history so we'll learn from our mistakes. If you remember being told that, I remember being told that. I don't think we've learned much if you look at it and you see where we are today. So with that in mind, do you think we are any better off now? Are we any better than what we're describing here? Do you see it in our world today? Okay, but remember when Elijah ran away from Jezebel and he went to Mount Horeb and he was so sure he was the only one left? And he said it twice when God asked him why he's there. I'm the only one left that's faithful. And what did God say to him? I still have thousands who haven't bowed their knee to Baal. And God still has his people. We are his people. But we're not alone either. You know, I'm a little Baptist girl raised in a Baptist church from the time I was born, sang the hymns on my father's lap when I was 3. My dad's a preacher. My mom's a Bible teacher. So, you know, I've been immersed in this all of my life. But you tend to think you're just in their own little cluster when that's true. And you don't realize what's out there. There are Christians everywhere you go to. There are believers in Jesus everywhere you go. We are not alone in this battle. We're not alone because the Lord's with us if we were the only one left, but we're not alone otherwise either. I was in BSF for years and I was a discussion leader, and we used to have to you had to meet on Tuesday if you're going to lead on Thursday, and we had to go through the week's lesson on Tuesday so we'd be ready to lead on Thursday. And we would do these questions, but nobody was allowed to talk about what church anybody went to because there were all Christian denominations in the room, and they just didn't let us do that. So one day they asked a question, and I knew the lady who decided to answer the question, I knew she wasn't a Baptist because she had talked previously about having her children baptized when they were babies. Okay, so first clue, they're not Baptists, we don't do that. So, but I didn't know what church she went to. So she answers this question with the biggest wisdom. It was such a thought out, wise answer to this question. And you know what the first thought that ran through my head was? She's not even a Baptist. And after it ran through my head, the next thought was, I can't believe you said that even to yourself. I'm glad it didn't come out of my mouth. We live in our own little circles, and we don't always see the bigger picture. And yes, this world is a mess, and yes, all this stuff and sin is there, and yes, it is the end times, but we are not alone. We're not alone. And we're not only not alone, we're here with a purpose and a God that enables us to do it. That's one of the important things to learn from even Hosea. There were still some faithful Jewish people in those nations. There were still some people who were following God in those nations. We all have a purpose that he calls us to. So another one, we have plenty of idols today. So I found a little definition of an idol. There's plenty of definitions of idols, by the way, but this is mine. Something we place above God. Anything more important to us than God. So that can be a person, it can be a thing, or it can be a place that we go to. But that does not mean that those things are bad when they're properly used. It's when they are put above God that they become an idol in our life. But so those good things can become idols. So I found a list. I get it. I love to Google things. I Googled, what's an idol today? And I found several people's lists. But I pulled some stuff that I like from what I found. The first one, which kind of surprised me a little as the number one thing on this guy's list, was that an idol today can be your identity. Okay, that would not have been my first thought, but your identity. Who we are in Christ needs to come first, not who we are otherwise. And then an idol can be money or material things. Money's the one that usually comes to mind because, you know, the love of money is the root of all evil, not money, but the love of it. Money and material things can be idols. The bigger house, the nicer car. I actually was talking to someone this week, and they were talking about that their father just passed away, and they were driving his Jeep something. And the guy he was talking to said, well, that's a pretty nice car. And he said, well, it doesn't drive like a Mercedes. Well, you ought to be glad you just got a car that's only 5 months old. What's the problem? Our jobs can be an idol. Our status in our jobs can be an idol. My youngest son just made partner in his law firm here about 2 months ago, and he was just chomping at the bit to make partner in his law firm. That can become an idol. It can become an idol. Our physical appearance, obviously, I don't have a problem with that, but some people do, and so our physical appearance can be an idol. Entertainment, and entertainment has grown exponentially in the last few years. It's no longer just the TV or what you hear on the radio, Netflix, podcast, lots of different ways to do entertainment. I will tell you, when I used to do the interviews for people who wanted Stephen ministers, that the one that was hardest for me um, to to try, I don't mean hard to deal with the person, but hard for me to believe, was how many people are dealing with internet pornography and how many women are dealing with husbands in the ministry dealing with internet pornography. It's amazing, and it becomes that thing they can't break. It becomes their idol. Comfort. Frank always tells me I choose comfort above beauty, and he's probably right about that. I would rather be comfortable than worry about what it looks like to anybody else in the world. But some people, their comfort is their most important thing. And even in here in Hosea, where he talks about you make all of your altars under shade trees, have comfort in your sin while you're at it. Phones. Anybody want to tell me how many phones are in this room? I watched a girl cross the street the other day. I was sitting at a red light, and she never looked up. She managed to step off the curb, walk across, and step up, but anybody could have run over her. She could have tripped on the thing. I've seen videos that they do where they show people running into glass walls and all kinds of things because they've got their phone in their hand and they can't put it down, or other technology. And then here's a good one. Your idol can be your family, and it can be your children. And your grandchildren. I have 2, and you have to watch it. Yeah. Your spouse. Children are a blessing from God, but they belong in their proper place of importance in our lives. Okay, so rather than making the mistake of Israel, we need to evaluate our lives, making sure nothing has become more important than God. Had a lady right out there Sunday morning. I had taught at 8 o'clock. I didn't go into the worship service. I sat outside. I was listening to the music, and I was listening to the beginning of the baptisms. And for some reason, I thought, I think I'll just walk around to the patio and wait until the 10:45 class I go to starts. So I was sitting there, and I literally had my phone out. Here we are, looking at it. And someone walked up, and it was a lady, and she said, "Are you Carol?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, I bet you don't remember me. I talked to you one time, and I didn't remember her. But she sat down to talk to me, and she told me that she was a golfer and that she loved to play golf and that she evidently played a lot of tournament golf. And she had had a heart attack in the spring and had open heart surgery, and so she was now healing from that and wasn't able to play. But what she told me that goes into this making something your idol, she said, I've been married twice. My first husband passed away, and I'm remarried now, but she said, he used to beg me to go to church with him and our 2 kids on Sunday, and I wouldn't go because I had golf. And she said, and then he died, and it's too late. And I thought, wow, sitting right there, never expecting that, and for a lot of reasons, I think that the Lord intended for me to have that encounter. But one of them was, she said, I've decided now I am not missing church on Sunday, and I'm not missing the things God has for me to go to for any reason at all. We should make something an idol to the point that we have to have someone die and we miss the opportunity. We need to ask the Lord, what are the idols in your life? Is there something I'm putting above you? And if there is, show me how to get it in its proper place so that you come first, that you're the one I come to first, that you're the one that leads and guides my life. No idol worship. So ask yourself, what is an idol in my life? Where do I spend my time? Where do I spend my money? Where do I get my joy? And what is always on my mind? Hosea is a tough book, but there's lessons to be learned. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the lessons you teach us and the way you take your word and you give it to us in a way that we can come to you and honor you with the very lives that we live. Help us to walk with you this week. Lord, I lift up and pray for Israel. I pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And I pray that you would show us anything and everything that we can do that will let you be Lord in this world. For it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. You have your tabletop questions, but do you need me to go over your answer sheet first? Okay. Hosea was prophesying to Israel and Judah because God wanted them to hear his plea that they return to worshiping him. These prophets were God's watchmen, warning Israel that God would surely judge their sin if they did not repent. Instead of listening, they called the prophets insane. In doing so, they were showing their hostility toward God himself. God told Israel not to rejoice because their time of rejoicing was ending. This was a result of God's promise of a curse on Israel if they broke their covenant promise. Covenant promise to God. God would not only judge their hostility, but he would also judge their idolatry. The promised land was holy to God. He considered the land as the place where he put his name. Verse 10:12 offers Israel the opportunity to return to him before his prophesied judgment would come. He called them to seek the Lord by cultivating righteousness, which means right standing with God. If they sowed in righteousness, they would reap in mercy. One benefit of studying Hosea today is that it can help us identify areas of our life where we need to live more faithfully before him. And it is not too late for us to return to full fellowship with God, who loves us and sent his only Son to die in our place and take away the penalty of sin. Did you miss any? Which one? The last one. It is not too late for us to return. Okay, and then your table questions. How would you describe idolatry in society today? In the Lord's commands to his people in Hosea 12, what message can you hear for today? There's still time. What attributes of God do you see in the book of Hosea? And I will just tag on to that I ask the Lord to show me more of who he is and what I am seeing about God that I've never really thought about a whole lot. I know it is how holy he is, how righteous he is, that he is God in all of his power, but righteous, so he has to judge. He has to judge sin. He can do no less. Okay.